A former sheriff's deputy serving time for murdering a woman in her Illinois home has died in prison.
Sean Grayson is dead. The former Illinois sheriff's deputy convicted of killing Sonya Massey died on August 23, 2026, while serving a 20-year prison sentence. He was 32 years old, and the timing is difficult to ignore. Just 3 weeks earlier, Grayson had asked Illinois authorities to release him from prison because of his deteriorating health. That request was denied. 3 votes, 0 votes in favor of release. And now, Grayson is gone. But before we go any further, there is something we need to make absolutely clear. We know Grayson had advanced cancer. We know he was serving a 20-year sentence. We know he requested medical release. We know the Illinois Prisoner Review Board denied that request on July 31st, and we know he died in custody on August 23rd. What we do not know, at least from the information publicly available so far, is the exact cause and circumstances of his death. So we're not going to fill those gaps with speculation, because there is already enough in the documented record to understand why this development matters. And the biggest question isn't simply, why did Sean Grayson die? The bigger question is, what happens to the Sonya Massey case now? Because when a defendant dies after conviction, the criminal prosecution doesn't simply continue as if nothing happened. But that doesn't mean the story disappears either. In fact, some of the most important questions surrounding Sonya Massey's death have very little to do with what happens to Sean Grayson now. They have to do with what happened before he ever entered her home. What happened inside that kitchen. What the body camera showed. What the jury ultimately decided. What Grayson maintained even after his conviction. Why he sought medical release. Why Sonya Massey's family opposed that request. And what changed in Illinois after her death? Because if we only focus on the newest headline, Sean Grayson is dead, we risk losing the story underneath it. And that story began with a 911 call. You're watching the Black Docket. We don't just repeat the headline. We follow the evidence, the court record, the timeline, and the developments that change what we understand about a case. If you want the story beyond the headline, subscribe to the Black Docket. Because this case has just taken another unexpected turn. On July 6, 2024, Sonya Massey was at her home near Springfield, Illinois. Massey was 36 years old, and she called 911 because she was concerned about a possible prowler. Think about that for a moment. The reason police entered Sonya Massey's home that morning was because she had called them for help. This wasn't initially a homicide investigation. It wasn't initially a confrontation between police and a suspect. It was a welfare-related response to a 911 call. 2 Sangamon County Sheriff's deputies arrived. One of them was Sean Grayson. And at first, the encounter appeared to be an ordinary police response. But once the deputies entered Massey's home, the situation changed, and the body cameras worn by the deputies would eventually become central to understanding exactly what happened next. Inside the house, there was a pot on the stove. Grayson instructed Massey to move it. Massey picked it up. She eventually placed it down. There was a verbal exchange between them, and then Massey said a religious phrase. Grayson drew his firearm. He threatened to shoot. Massey apologized. She moved behind the kitchen counter. And then Grayson fired 3 shots. Massey was struck and killed. The confrontation lasted only moments, but those moments would become the central evidence in a criminal prosecution. And that is important because this case did not ultimately depend only on someone's memory of what happened. The public would eventually be able to see much of the confrontation for themselves. The body camera footage became a critical part of the investigation, and when that footage became public, the case exploded nationally. People weren't simply reading a description of the shooting. They could watch the interaction. They could hear the exchange. They could see the physical environment. They could examine the positions of the people inside the kitchen. And that created an important legal question. What exactly did Sean Grayson believe was happening in those final seconds? Grayson maintained that he believed Sonya Massey was going to attack him with the boiling water. That explanation became a central part of the defense. But prosecutors saw the situation differently. Their argument was essentially that the circumstances did not justify the use of deadly force. And that distinction became the heart of the criminal case. Because nobody was arguing over whether Grayson fired his weapon. The body camera footage made that obvious. The legal question was whether his use of deadly force was justified. That is a much more specific question. And eventually, it would be decided by a jury. But before that happened, Grayson's life changed almost immediately. He was fired from the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office. He was charged with murder, and the case quickly moved beyond Springfield. National attention focused on the body camera footage, the circumstances of the shooting, and Grayson's history in law enforcement. The case also became part of a much larger conversation about policing. What happens when an officer responds to someone who may be experiencing a behavioral health crisis? How should officers evaluate a perceived threat? How quickly should deadly force be used? And how much information should an agency know about an officer before putting that person in a position where they can use lethal force? Those questions were bigger than Grayson. But Grayson was still the person facing the criminal prosecution. And in October 2025, that prosecution finally went to trial. The prosecution sought a first-degree murder conviction. The defense continued to argue that Grayson believed he was facing a deadly threat. The jury had to evaluate the body camera evidence, testimony, physical circumstances, and competing explanations of what happened in those final moments. And then came the verdict. The jury did not convict Grayson of first-degree murder. Instead, he was found guilty of second-degree murder. That distinction matters, but it is equally important not to misunderstand what the verdict meant. Grayson was still convicted of murder. The jury did not accept the defense's position to the extent necessary to acquit him. He was criminally responsible for Sonya Massey's death. Then came sentencing. On January 29, 2026, Judge Ryan Cadigan sentenced Grayson to 20 years in prison. That was the maximum sentence for the second-degree murder conviction. The sentence also included mandatory supervised release after imprisonment, with credit for time already served. At that point, the case appeared to have reached a familiar stage. A defendant had been convicted, a sentence had been imposed, and the legal system had determined the punishment. But there was something else happening at the same time. Grayson was seriously ill. He had been diagnosed with colon cancer before the shooting. By the time he was sentenced, his condition had advanced. The cancer had spread to his liver and lungs. And suddenly, the question surrounding Grayson's future wasn't only how many years would he spend in prison, it was, would he live long enough to serve them? That question became central several months later. In May 2026, Grayson sought medical release under Illinois law. His request was based on his advanced cancer and deteriorating health, and this created a completely different kind of legal proceeding. The jury had already decided the criminal case. The judge had already imposed the sentence. The medical release proceeding wasn't another trial. It wasn't a second opportunity to decide whether Grayson was guilty. It was about whether his medical condition justified allowing him to leave prison before completing his sentence. And that distinction is important, because there were now two competing interests. On one side was Grayson's medical condition. On the other was the sentence imposed after his conviction and the interests of the victims and their families. Sonya Massey's family opposed the request. The state's attorney also opposed the release, and the arguments around the request brought the original case back into public view. Because Grayson wasn't simply asking for medical treatment. He was asking to leave prison. And the people who opposed the request argued that his illness should not automatically erase the punishment imposed after his conviction. There was also an important detail in the way Grayson described the original shooting. Even after his conviction, he continued to maintain his version of what happened. He maintained that Massey had attacked him with the pot of boiling water. That position mattered because it showed that the underlying dispute over those final moments had not simply disappeared after the verdict. The jury had made its decision. The conviction was on the record. But Grayson still maintained his account. Then came July 31st. The Illinois Prisoner Review Board considered the request, and the board voted unanimously to deny it. 3 votes, 0 in favor of release. Grayson would remain in custody. And at that moment, the case seemed to have entered a new phase. The conviction remained. The 20-year sentence remained. The medical release request had been denied, and Grayson remained incarcerated while battling advanced cancer. But nobody knew that the decision would become one of the last major legal developments of his life. 3 weeks later, Sean Grayson died. August 23, 2026. Grayson was 32 years old. He died while in custody. And that immediately created a new wave of questions. What happened? Was his death related to his cancer? What exactly happened inside the correctional system? And did the medical release decision have anything to do with what happened? Those questions may be understandable. But right now, they are questions. They are not facts. There is no basis for us to say that the denial of medical release caused Grayson's death. There is no basis to claim that authorities knew he was about to die. And there is no basis to turn the timing into a conclusion. The responsible thing is to distinguish between what is documented and what remains unknown. Grayson had advanced cancer. He requested medical release. The request was denied. He died 3 weeks later. Those facts are enough. And until authorities release additional information, anything beyond them belongs in the category of speculation. But now we get to the question many people are asking. Does Sean Grayson's death change his conviction? No. The jury already returned its verdict. He was already convicted of second-degree murder. His death does not turn that conviction into an acquittal. It does not rewrite the trial record. It does not erase the sentence that was imposed. And it does not change the evidence that the jury considered. But there is another legal reality. Grayson cannot now serve the remaining portion of his prison sentence. He cannot be brought back into court for a new criminal trial, and the state cannot continue prosecuting him as though he were still alive. His criminal case effectively ends with his death because there is no longer a living defendant against whom criminal punishment can be carried out. But that does not mean every legal or public question surrounding Sonya Massey's death disappears. This is where the story becomes much bigger than Sean Grayson. Because Sonya Massey's death produced consequences outside the criminal courtroom. Her case became part of a national conversation about police accountability. It also led to legislative action in Illinois. The state enacted legislation known as the Sonya Massey Act. And the reason that matters is because lawmakers were not only asking what happened inside Massey's kitchen, they were also asking questions about the systems that put officers into positions of authority. How are officers screened? What information about an officer's previous employment is available to a new department? Are agencies doing enough to identify warning signs? And what happens when an officer moves from one law enforcement agency to another? Those are systemic questions, and systemic questions do not end when an individual defendant dies. The case also led to federal scrutiny. The Justice Department investigated policing practices in Sangamon County after Massey's death. That investigation produced reforms involving policing practices and responses to people experiencing behavioral health crises. Again, notice what happened here. A criminal case began with one 911 call. It became a police shooting investigation, then a murder prosecution, then a jury verdict, then a prison sentence, then a medical release request. And now, the defendant is dead. But the consequences of the original event have continued moving through courts, government agencies, police departments, and legislation. That's why saying, "the case is over," can be misleading. The criminal prosecution against Grayson is over. The broader consequences of Sonya Massey's death are not. And there is another part of this story that deserves attention. The newest headline can easily make the victim disappear from the narrative. For the last several days, people may see headlines about Sean Grayson, his age, his sentence, his illness, his death, his medical release request. But Sonya Massey was at the center of this case long before Sean Grayson's name became nationally known. She was 36 years old. She called 911. She believed she needed police assistance, and she died inside her own home. Everything that came afterward happened because of that moment. The investigation, the body camera footage, the national attention, the criminal charges, the trial, the conviction, the sentence, the medical release hearing, the legislative changes, the federal investigation, and now Grayson's death. That is why this story shouldn't end with Sean Grayson is dead. That is the newest development. It is not the entire story, and there is another important question that deserves attention. What does Grayson's death mean for the historical record? There will no longer be a possibility of hearing directly from him in a future proceeding. There will be no future prison interviews as part of his sentence. There will be no possibility of him completing the sentence imposed by the court. And if future questions arise about his conduct, investigators and researchers will have to rely on the evidence that already exists. That means the body camera footage matters even more. The court filings matter. The trial testimony matters. The verdict matters. The official reports matter, because those records are what remain. And this is one reason accuracy matters so much when covering developing cases. A story can change quickly. A headline can change within hours. A rumor can spread across social media before authorities have released a single official statement. And once a false claim gets repeated enough times, people can start remembering it as though it were established fact. That's not what we're going to do here. If new information emerges about Grayson's death, then the story changes. If authorities release an official cause of death, we report it. If additional documents become public, we examine them. If new information changes what we understand about the medical release request, we update the story. But until then, we stay with what can actually be established. And that brings us back to the central question. What happens to Sonya Massey's case now? The answer depends on which part of the case you're talking about. The criminal prosecution against Sean Grayson? That has effectively ended. The conviction? It remains part of the record. The sentence? It can no longer be served because Grayson has died. The medical release request? It is no longer relevant to his future because there is no future sentence for him to serve. But the questions surrounding Sonya Massey's death, those remain part of the public record. The policy changes? They remain. The law? It remains. The federal scrutiny? Its consequences remain. And the family? They remain. That's the uncomfortable part of cases like this. The legal system can produce a verdict. A judge can impose a sentence. A prison can hold a convicted defendant. A legislature can pass a law. A government agency can announce reforms. And eventually, even the defendant can die. But none of those things can reverse the original loss. Sonya Massey cannot come home. Her family cannot get back the life they had before July 6, 2024. And that's why the focus should not shift entirely to the circumstances of Sean Grayson's death. His death is important because it is the newest development, but Sonya's death is what created this case in the first place. And if there is one thing worth taking from this latest development, it is that the end of a criminal defendant's life does not automatically mean the end of the questions created by the crime. In this case, those questions are now bigger than one person. What did the evidence show? What did the jury conclude? Were the reforms that followed sufficient? Did the changes actually address the failures that lawmakers and investigators identified? And will the systems that were changed because of Sonya Massey's death actually work differently the next time an officer responds to someone in crisis? Those are questions that cannot be answered by a prison sentence. and they cannot be answered by a defendant's death. They can only be answered over time. So let's go back to the timeline one final time. July 6, 2024. Sonya Massey calls 911. Deputies respond. Sean Grayson enters her home. The confrontation escalates. Grayson fires 3 shots. Massey dies. The body camera footage becomes central to the investigation. Grayson is fired. He is charged with murder. October 2025. The case goes to trial. The jury finds Grayson guilty of second-degree murder. January 29, 2026. He receives the maximum 20-year sentence. May 2026. Grayson seeks medical release because of his advanced cancer. July 31. The Illinois Prisoner Review Board votes 3-0 to deny the request. August 23. Sean Grayson dies in custody. And now we're here. One chapter of this case has ended. But the broader story continues. Because the question isn't only what happened to Sean Grayson. The question is what happened to Sonya Massey. What happened inside that house. What the evidence established. What the jury decided. What changed afterward. And whether those changes will actually make a difference. That is the part worth following. And that is what we'll continue to follow. If you're following the Sonya Massey case, tell us what you think about this latest development. Not rumors. Not unverified theories. The facts. Does Grayson's death change how this case should be remembered? Or should the focus remain on Sonya Massey, the evidence presented at trial, and the reforms that followed? And if new information emerges about Grayson's death or the continuing consequences of this case, we'll bring you the update. Subscribe to the Black Docket if you want true crime coverage that doesn't stop at the headline. We follow the timeline. We examine the evidence. And when something changes, we explain what actually changed. Because in a developing case, the newest headline is rarely the whole story. This is the Black Docket, and we'll see you in the next case.